Welcome to another edition of the Mael Time podcast. I'm joined today by Lishi Baker, a junior at Columbia studying Middle East history and co-chair of Columbia REA, a student-led Israel engagement group. Lishi, thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
And before we get going, I'm just going to say that in high school, Lishi's father was my headmaster, so I've known Lishi since he was probably either in diapers or just out of diapers. You're at Columbia. What the heck is going on?
Okay, so we had a long day the other day with the library break-in. Basically, a mob stormed through the front door of the main library during finals, pushed through a bunch of public safety officers, took over the main reading room on the third floor, which is where basically hundreds of students are doing their final studying, their essay writing, all of that, and kind of barricaded themselves in the room. Columbia Public Safety immediately responded and basically said, well, this is a huge rules violation, so you can't leave the room unless you show your IDs. So all of a sudden, the entire group on the inside freaked out, and they said, "Well, shoot, we're gonna get caught." So they started trying to barrel out through the public safety. At the same time, a group gathered outside the library and tried to barrel in. So you kind of had like two fronts, both one trying to get in, one trying to get out, to support each other, chanting "Intifada, Intifada." We don't want no Zionists here. You know, in Arabic, from water to water, Palestine will be Arab. All the classic anti-Semitic kind of violent chants that we hear, defacing the library, defacing the shelves.
Students?
So at least, I saw a report that at least 50 of the 75 or so that were arrested were students. And then there were some other affiliates of other, peer universities or just outsiders that somehow got onto campus. But this was a student-led effort, and the people that were outside of the library trying to push in and chanting through megaphones through the window to support them, those people were, as far as I could tell, all or vast majority students.
So these are not outside influencers. I know on many campuses people come from all over to participate. I'll never forget when I was at WashU in St. Louis, there was a screening of some anti-Israel movie, and about 90% of the crowd was not actually students. And when everything broke out after October 7th, was it also primarily students, or do you think that it was pushed from the outside?
So definitely primarily students. There's an outside push, right, within our lifetime, which is a very openly pro-terror group that is kind of based in New York and is able to rally the New York crazies to come to the
Jewish,
gates.
Right?
No, that within our lifetime doesn't claim they're Jewish. That's
Jewish Voice
for Peace,
all these other things,
and all these other things. So within our lifetime is just kind of run by this woman Nerdine Kiswani, who's I think banned from some places. She's as bad as it gets, and they're the people that show up to our gates and have assaulted people outside the gates, including I think Yosef Haddad was punched right outside our gates by somebody affiliated within our lifetime.
Yosef Haddad, of course, is a Muslim Israeli, Arab Israeli who served in Golani, but is definitely not Jewish. And it would be quite ironic that a white person from North America punched an Arab.
It's documented on video.
Right.
It's all on video. So this is a violent group, and they've been very supportive of our kind of Palestine student movement. But it's a student-led effort on the inside. And I think what's important to know also is that for the last year, our gates at Columbia have been closed unless you have a guest pass or a student ID or a faculty ID. So in order to get in, basically, you have to swipe not only into the buildings, but into the campus itself. Right, so WashU obviously is a little bit more of an open campus and a bigger campus. I remember visiting WashU and taking, 20 minutes to walk across from one end to the other. To walk across Columbia's campus is 5 minutes. It's enclosed within the city. So in order to get here, you actually have to be able to swipe in or have a student register you as a guest. So it's impossible that this could happen without not just students involved, but students driving and leading the effort.
And I ended my college career at Brandeis, quite perhaps infamously, famously, whatever it might be. And it was a lot of anti-Israel activity at Brandeis and really across the campuses. I graduated in 2015, but it wasn't at all shocking to me after October 7th. I'm actually quite angry at the groups that say they're so shocked by this happening, because it's been happening, if perhaps under the surface, but just a bit over the surface, at least on almost every campus. Now, I'm not going to ask you what you were thinking when you were in high school and applied to Columbia, but were you actually truly shocked that there's people that hate Israel and hate Jews on campus?
So I don't think I was truly shocked by the Israel hate. And also coming to Columbia, even though you didn't ask, I will just say I knew coming in that like this is a place that is the intellectual academic epicenter of anti-Zionism. I mean, this is a school that hosts the legacy of Edward Said and celebrates it. And a Middle East Studies department that, I take many classes in, that is just filled with professors who are openly against Israel's existence, not just against the current Israeli government, and teach that in their classes shamelessly. Right? Joseph Massad, for example, is famous for not only teaching Rasheed Khaled, whose class I actually was in during the fall of 2023. And I actually wore an Israeli flag as a cape to his class in the 2 weeks after October 7th. It was a big lecture.
What was his response to that?
He didn't engage with that. He actually engaged with me one-on-one when I asked him questions, but it didn't make sense for me to argue in a lecture and give him the opportunity to basically, have the last word in front of 150 students. So I tried to go to his office hours and kind of understand his perspective. But Joseph Massad, for example, I mean, he's somebody who teaches the Khazar theory and who has said openly that Ashkenazi Jews are not real descendants of the real Israelites, and that we're basically, he called us a strange European group that's making up their ancestral ties. I mean, that's not just anti-Israel. That is like so deeply anti-Semitic. It's so obvious. And this is somebody who has tenure in the Middle East Studies department here. I think what was surprising for me, so not the Israel hate, not even the Jew hate, because I knew that that existed when I came here. But what was surprising for me was just how deeply anti-American and anti-Western this movement could get. Like we had major student groups on this campus. There's a big coalition. I think over 85 of them are still signed. Columbia University Apartheid Divest posted an Instagram in the summer in which they called themselves Westerners Fighting for the Total Eradication of Western Civilization. I mean, that's at least they're honest. At least they're honest, right?
Right. They're not even hiding it.
They're not hiding. I confronted a table of them in one of the first weeks of school, and I said, here we are with the Westerners fighting for the eradication of Western civilization. What do you have to say for yourselves? And, I asked them, what do you have to say about Columbia's core curriculum, which is literally the Western canon that every Columbia student has to take? And they said, basically, destroy it all except for African civilizations. Now, I don't really know what that means other than, no respect for the great works of our time and of the last thousands of years, and they just live in this alternate reality.
Now, I want to ask you before we move on, why did you take Rasheed Khaledi's class? What was your expectation?
So I don't feel that I need to be in classes that are, going to be comfortable for me. I think, part of the reason I wanted to be here was to expand my base of knowledge, especially around the Middle East. I feel like I've had an amazing Israel education at Gann Academy, at the Hartman Institute for a year. I feel, and just with, in my Jewish community with my parents, with my friends and their parents as well. And I kind of thought, I want to be involved in Israel-related, Middle East-related work for the rest of my life. It's what drives me. It's what I'm passionate about. And there's nothing more important, I think, than, besides understanding my own narrative and our narrative, than understanding their narrative as well, so that I can go into conversations and not be shocked, so that I can try to find where are the places within our stories where there's room for reconciliation, and where are the places where we're basically going to have an existential tension. And I think going into the Rasheed Khaledi's class with that in mind, right, with understanding this class is called History of the Modern Middle East, but in my mind, I know that what I'm learning is Rasheed Khaledi's History of the Modern Middle East, and I'm learning it for the sake of understanding his story. That was kind of my main thought process going.
And what was your biggest takeaway from that class?
My biggest takeaway from that class were two things. One, that what drives a lot of his narrative, and I think a lot of the mainstream academic Palestinian narrative, I think dating back to Edward Said, also Orientalism, is a deep anti-nationalism, right? It's hypocritical too, and I confronted him about this, because you say you're an anti-nationalist except that you support Palestinian nationalism. That's the exception to the rule, which to me is just not intellectually honest. But what they speak about a lot is how nationalism and the arrival of nation states to the Middle East in the first place was unjust. Now, why are they only calling for the eradication of one of the nation states, Israel? I think, that's where we can start to point the finger of double standard and, singling out of the Jews as a particular group that doesn't deserve a state. The second big takeaway that I had is that in order to serve, I think, the anti-nationalist narrative, Khaledi presents Zionism as both legitimate, maybe not legitimate, but classic, real nationalistic ideology, right? Like he says, Jews truly believe, Zionists truly believe in their national project, their nationalism. That's Zionism. And at the same time, he says, that doesn't change the fact that it can also be settler colonialism. And so he basically tries to put the two together and say, to talk about Zionism, you don't have to deny that it's real nationalism. You just have to also say that it's settler colonialism. Now, for me, I'm sitting there thinking, wow, there's 150 other people in this room, most of whom are taking this as their only class on the Middle East in college. Now, how problematic is it that they are all going to walk out of this lecture with one understanding of Zionism, that it's nationalism is bad, and that it's settler colonialism? Those are like the main takeaways from the Israel section of his class.
What did he say after October 7th?
So he did say something in class. It was interesting. When he walked into class after October 7th, he didn't want to comment on, what happened. I think, I didn't ask, honestly. I was obviously a little bit still in shock about what was happening. But what he said was something along the lines of, listen, this is a hard time, and be nice to the people that you love and hold each other. And I actually thought that was an okay message. I thought that was like a nice thing to say. And since October 7th,
the bar
I
is
think...
so low you could trip.
Right, exactly. The bar's low.
Love. Come on.
I agree. And,
like, hey,
in my...
Hamas, or he couldn't just say, hey, this is a deviation from Palestinian nationalism, or is that actually the fulfillment of Palestinian nationalism?
So I think it's hard for him to say that, and I don't know why. But I mean, one interesting story, another one with him. I've had a lot of interactions with him. I went to an event that he did, and I asked him, he wrote the book called 100 Years War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance from 1917 to 2017. So I asked him, I named a few terrorist attacks or types of terrorist attacks. And I said, you wrote the book on settler colonialism and resistance as the narrative. Is this thus justified resistance? And he said, and I'll never forget this answer, he said, I'm a historian. I don't prescribe moral judgment. I just describe what happens and what people do in response to certain phenomena. I think it's lazy. I don't think that you can say as a historian who writes a book that gets used for political purposes to say, oh, but I didn't intend for that to happen, so I'm not at fault in any way, or I'm just a historian, so I can't prescribe any kind of moral judgment to things. I just describe objectively. Every historian writes with a bias. That's just a fact of writing history. And to deny that, I think, is just, again, intellectually dishonest.
So do you think that other Jewish people that go to Columbia or any other university should take classes with professors that are, in your words, intellectually dishonest and border on anti-Semitic?
I think it depends on the student. I do think that people who've had strong, like Israel and Jewish education, I think could benefit a lot from these experiences. Again, because it's important to just understand in their words how they tell the story. But for somebody who's like looking to understand the Middle East, to take only one of these classes is just, you're not getting a full education, and in fact you're getting a biased and incomplete story around the Middle East. And if you take this class and you don't know that, and you go in and you're starstruck, oh, Rasheed Khaled, because he's famous, and he's very well known, and in that world very well respected, it can actually do a lot of damage, I think, to your academics, to your education.
Perhaps the most famous grad student at Columbia now, or former grad student, is Mahmoud Khalil. Did you interact with him at all?
No, I didn't have much real interaction with him. We would see each other at protests, because I would always go to protests, and I still do, with a video camera and sometimes a megaphone. To counter protest. Me and my friends, we like to, when they say free Palestine, we yell from Hamas. They don't like that, but we do it anyways. I've had a few kind of bump in interactions with him. He once yelled, the last time I saw him, actually, I was videoing a protest in Barnard College library where they were handing out literally Hamas propaganda made from the Hamas media office. And I was just videoing people. And he comes up behind me and he goes, haven't you done enough doxing for the day? And he starts yelling at me about that. And I'm thinking, listen, I'm not doxing anyone. And you're all wearing masks anyway, so I don't even know who you are.
If they're publicly doing something?
So they love to use that excuse, doxing. It's their way to avoid accountability. If we say anything about them, it's doxing. If they say things about us, it's just holding us accountable. It's hypocritical. I don't even...
No, but I can understand if someone says something in a group chat, right, of like, say, the students that are in Rasheed Khaled's class, and all of a sudden you start publishing it. I think it's still the public, because there's a lot of people in the group, but I can understand why someone would say that you are kind of violating the sanctity of the class space. But to say that you go to a public space and you're doing something publicly, and then therefore you're doxing someone by just saying that this person handed out Hamas propaganda, doesn't make any sense.
I completely agree with that. The argument that they make does not hold any water, and it's just like, it's a way for them to basically play victim, which is what they're best at, as a movement.
I want to ask about the pro-Israel influencers coming to campus and rallying and everything like that. In my experience as an undergrad, it was conflicting, because on some hand, it's helpful to have attention brought to certain incidents and to bring in people that can help change the narrative. And at the same time, there are some clowns who do not actually help the situation and are very destructive. What has your experience been with pro-Israel influencers coming to the Columbia campus?
Yeah, I think that's a like a wise way to think about it. At a certain point, like, we're advocating here at Columbia both to make sure that our voices are heard, and that you can't shout, we don't want no Zionists here, without Zionists coming and saying, well, we're not going anywhere, we're here. That's like a huge part of it, and a lot of what we do is around kind of just raising the Jewish voice. And when it comes to that side of everything, I think it's actually awesome that so many people have stepped up as influencers, used their platforms for, sharing the Jewish narrative, fighting for Israel. I think that's something that's really amazing. And I think also at the same time, there's also, I think, structural changes at Columbia that we have been pushing for very publicly throughout the last, year and a half, almost 2 years at this point, around time, place, and manner regulations at Columbia, and around masks and all these other things. And sometimes it's not helpful to have really loud screamers outside the gates who are screaming like bloody hell at the administration, when at the same time, we had a meeting or had been trying to lobby the administration to make some kind of changes just a week earlier, right? Like it can sometimes conflict with the intra-Colombia advocacy that we were doing. But, again, as long as people behave themselves and are not, committing any acts of violence, or shouting things that are just like making them look like a Chilul Hashem, like, and making our entire Jewish community at Columbia look disrespectful or racist in any way, like, as long as people are kind of holding it together and just kind of elevating the Jewish story, Israel, and, Zionism and Jewish identity, like, to me, that's awesome. And ideally they follow our lead as kind of like the student organizers, but, we understand that, people have their own followings, their own agendas, and we try to work with that as much as we can.
I see your blue pin, and of course that's tied into Bob Kraft's initiative, Standing Against Hate. And this past week, everything going on with Dave Portnoy, El Presidente, actually when I got in an incident there was an African-American student leader at Brandeis who actually supported cop killing in 2014. And I wrote a post about it where I embedded her tweet, and I was working with Ben Shapiro at the time. And then Mark Levin, the great one, retweeted it. It was on the Drudge Report. It went crazy. And they actually started a petition to try to have me expelled from Brandeis for, I think the language was for something along the lines of doxing and endangering her life. And she actually just wrote a post saying that she almost died at Brandeis because I literally quoted her own tweet in an article. It's quite crazy. And El Presidente actually stood up and wrote a blog post about this incident back in the day. And he said, I don't understand how someone could defame this woman. She defamed herself by being an idiot. That's what she said. That's what he said. And now we have this Mo Khan thing at Temple. I'm curious, A, your take on that and everything that happened there. And then B, the response, the idea to send these two clowns to Auschwitz. Personally, I think it's the wrong approach. I think it comes from a good place, but I don't understand why we're wasting time on these two knuckleheads. I think that investing in Jewish students and their identity and what they have to engage with is probably a better way. But I'm curious your take on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, wow, the Mo Khan situation, that is like it's a textbook example of like, that kid ruined his own life. Nothing Dave Portnoy says or nothing we all say backing him up. And by the way, he has been so strong on this. I mean, I think his messaging around Mo Khan has been spot on, right? This kid is an idiot. You can't, post an F the Jews sign and then go on a neo-Nazis podcast while at the same time saying, I'm just a citizen journalist, and ask my parents about the other post that I made where I said throw a quarter on the ground and find a Jew. I mean, the kid he's ruined his own life, and well deserved. And I've been retweeting also, some of El Presidente's stuff around Mo Khan, because I just think, like, first of all, I'm so grateful to him for being such a morally clear, public figure on this, but also because I think it's important to just have as a fellow student, like, this is not something that Jewish students are going to tolerate, and we're going to contribute to, making it clear that this can happen. And when you ruin your life like that by being an idiot and by trafficking anti-Semitism, we're going to respond. On the question of sending them to Auschwitz, I don't know if anything is ever really enough for this kind of person. I definitely wouldn't say that sending somebody like this, who's clearly got real deep-rooted anti-Semitism, sending him to Auschwitz would kind of fix that. I definitely don't think it would hurt. I think it's important to continue Holocaust education as much as possible with as many people as possible. But again, once this kid, the more we've learned about him, the less it makes sense, I think, to send him to Auschwitz. And I think, and Portnoy agrees. He basically said, yeah, this is rescinded.
Yeah, he said he got played. My point is just if there's limited resources on campus,
right,
and a lot of different groups are trying to do the right thing. I think there are many groups that are genuinely trying to do the right thing. But at the end of the day, there are limited resources, and who are you going to invest in? And I'm not on the Columbia campus. I'm sure you can name 10 kids who would benefit from an all expenses paid trip to Europe to learn about Jewish history, right? And whether or not they're Jewish or not, why do you have to choose the most egregious lunatic?
I think that's a fair argument. I will say, from the perspective also of a Columbia Jewish student, like Robert Kraft and his family have been so generous with us. I mean, our Hillel is the Kraft Center for Jewish Student Life. Mr. Kraft actually came to our Yom Ha'atzmaut party on campus and, gave a message to the students and met people and just was kind of like schmoozing. In the flesh, in person, onto campus to schmooze, to give a message of support. I mean, he has just been so amazingly supportive of our community and, also obviously the Boston community in so many ways. So, I just want to express our gratitude for him and what he's done for us.
He's the man. And if I remember when Ezra Schwartz was murdered in Israel and they did the moment of silence at the Patriots game, he's always had his head on very, very straight and standing up for the Jewish community. It's a very special family.
Absolutely.
Shabbos Kestenbaum made a little bit of noise when he started rating organizations, and I'm not trying to get you into trouble, but what would you say are the most helpful organizations on campus nowadays?
Yeah, I mean,
in the Jewish, we're against Jews getting attacked by jihadis on campus groups.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there was a lot of noise around that. I mean, for me personally, the two that have been most supportive are local, right? Columbia Barnard Hillel, the Kraft Center for Jewish Student Life, and the Chabad at Columbia University. Like we're really lucky, and I feel really lucky, and I don't take it for granted that our Hillel staff, and our Chabad family and our Chabad community and these two organizations, not only individually, separately, have been super supportive, but they actually have collaborated on so much, and there's no institutional beef between the two, and it just like when you put you put one and one together, it equals three for the Jewish community at Columbia. So those two have far and away been the most helpful for me. And I remember
it's important to note, because I've seen this since I was a student, and now in the last 19 months or so, there's so much of bigger organizations, and I'll just say by and large well-intentioned, but taking highlights or something that's going on and then running to donors and saying, look, we have to fight this, so people would give money toward a cause. And it has nothing to do with that actual incident or that cause or how to better the situation on campus. And it's very important for people to realize that there are groups and organizations that are local to the campus that are very capable of helping and perhaps would have a better feel and sense of what needs to be done, and can almost definitely do it with less overhead. So it's an important thing.
It's definitely, I totally agree. I think that the question that I would just raise, I think, for the American Jewish community is just to think about how do we replicate, I think, the success of the Columbia Jewish institutions, which like we said are local and kind of directly on the ground, engaging with students and active, they're a model of success. How do we replicate that on a larger scale? And I think in particular, how do we take the lessons from Columbia's, I think, let's just use Columbia's Hillel, and apply it to a school that maybe doesn't have as many resources in its Jewish community? I think that is a question that, that we need to be thinking about, and I'm sure many people are thinking about. And, when we think about Hillel International, right? I think it could be easy in a way for somebody in a school with a massive Jewish community to say, well, I don't really know anything about Hillel International. I just know my Hillel. But I think we also forget that for schools with very small Hillels and small Jewish communities with fewer resources, like Hillel International is like the reason that they even have a Hillel, right? So it's a complicated, I think, a complicated reality when it comes to kind of resource sharing and who benefits from those kinds of resource sharing, right? Obviously, the smaller ones are going to benefit more from the umbrella than the larger ones. But that doesn't mean the larger ones necessarily should withdraw from the umbrella. So I just think these are questions, I think, facing the American Jewish world that are worth thinking about.
And I'll just add to that, the groups that were in charge of combating anti-Semitism and dealing with the situation on campus, it's fair to say that after October 7th, they got a giant F, or perhaps worse. And I think that just because they have a larger marketing budget or they have far-reaching access to donors, that doesn't mean that their approach worked, and it doesn't mean that they should be the ones shepherding in the next iterations of how to combat campus anti-Semitism. When I was on campus, these same groups were formulating the strategy, saying that they had the solution to deal with people learning these radical theories that are anti-Israel and anti-Western. And then you see after October 7th, objectively, like it did not work. And there's a lot of other influences working against it, specifically Qatar and other countries that are trying to funnel money in, and other institutions that are trying to funnel money in. But I do think that the American Jewish community really needs to think about how to best approach it and who's actually making some of those larger strategical decisions. Because, and I'll never forget, I was actually at an event with your father, and Bob Kraft was there. I remember I had just taken a picture with Bob Kraft, actually. So excited to see him. And someone pulled me aside and said, just be careful with your work with that extremist Ben Shapiro. Because if you're more mainstream, it will, you can have a bigger impact or something along those lines. Now, of course, we see how the next 10 years went, and Ben's unbelievable. He's always been unbelievable, but there's this tendency of kind of like that center to be so sure that they're the ones who are absolutely right about how to go about these things. And I'm not trying to finger point, but we have to at least acknowledge, I think, as a greater American Jewish community, that the way that the campus was handled combating some of these narratives just did not work. And we have to deal with the after effect, and it requires deep introspection. And you've been the one who experiencing it. I'm curious your take on that.
Yeah, I do. I think, I think again, I can only really speak to the Columbia experience because I wasn't there for other schools responding to this, but we threw together a response very quickly. But like, just to give you some insight, like the first major, there was a vigil that we held on October 9th, 2023. That was organized largely by Chabad and Hillel together, which was beautiful on campus. We had speakers, lit candles. It was at night. I think that was like our first communal response. And then on October 12th, we kind of knew that there was going to be a big, pro-Palestine or whatever you want to call it, rally, pro-Hamas rally on campus. And just to give you some insight into like what our planning to respond to that was, it was like me and 5 other people sitting on the terrace in the craft center, basically brainstorming, all right, what do we want to do? What do we want our response to look like? Do we want it to be a shouting match? Do we want to do songs? Do we want to do moments of silence? Do we want to do speeches or no speeches? Where are we going to get the flags? Luckily, the Hillel actually had a ton of flags. And what we ended up deciding on was we were going to do 22 minutes of silence, which was 1 second for each of the victims at the time that we knew about, and then do Jewish songs in a circle. And the reason was both to give our community an opportunity to kind of grieve in public and be together in public, but also that we understand that from a PR perspective, like one group is a mob screaming Intifada, Intifada, and the other group is a Jewish community singing Achenu, Hatikva, and Oseh Shalom B'Marmav, right? Like, that is a really good reflection of who we are as a community. And I think at that moment in time, that worked, and that worked for us and people. It was such a big success, and we kind of ran with it. The people who organized that, you know, I was standing in the middle with a megaphone singing. My sister's a really good singer. I'm like an okay singer. And I was in there with a megaphone singing like Achenu and all these songs into a megaphone with hundreds of people there. And I guess like I just kind of sucked it up and knew that I didn't sound great, but it was such a success that after that,
did you feel safe?
There were, on that day we did, because we were on separate lawns, and there was literally like you know, dozens of public safety people. NYPD was in the area, you know, kind of in between the two groups, and like the lawns have fences around them, so we were actually like in two separate areas. But all I'll say is like, going from there, we kind of like built a movement off of the back of that first thing. And every time we did things that the community felt reflected our community well, or you know, was meaningful for people, those of us who were kind of organizing it just gained more credibility. And that's kind of how you become a leader, I think, on campus, is you just do stuff. You just make it happen. And you know, for us, we had institutional resources backing us, but even so, like we were all figuring it out, I think, alongside the institutions, you know, as we went.
Where does Columbia go from here?
A lot of work to do, I think, for Columbia. You know, first and foremost, I think, you know, making sure that some of these rules are set in stone around where you can protest, you know, time, place, and manner. You know, where you can protest. Are there specific times that you can protest? The Anti-Semitism Task Force at Columbia actually outlined all of these in one of their reports, and I think they did a great job of it. I think it'd be awesome if Columbia kind of finalized, you know, accepting those as the policies. But I think at Columbia, it's also important to note that since 1968, you know, 1968, there were big protests here. The last time Hamilton Hall got totally occupied, taken over by student activists, they created a university senate to basically democratize parts of university governance at Columbia. And for years, it kind of existed, and they did a lot of stuff, but I don't think it was clear, at least to me, how impactful they might be. And all of a sudden, 2023 rolls around in 2024, and it turns out the University Senate, which, by the way, is largely made up of humanities faculty who support the protesters, is the group that's in charge of the rules of university conduct and the disciplinary process. So luckily, Columbia has moved the disciplinary process away from the Senate now and into the provost's office, right? So now you don't have like faculty members that are literally holding up discipline for people who break into buildings. But you know, our acting president announced a review of the University Senate. You know, I don't know what that's going to entail, but I think it's absolutely necessary. I think looking at the ways in which faculty here have been over-empowered, and therefore administration has been kind of disempowered. I wrote an article about this in the Superior Journal, actually. You know, Columbia needs countercultural leadership. And by that I mean Columbia's culture of leadership is a culture, or was at least, and you know, we're starting to see some change, which is awesome, but was a culture of disempowered administration and overly empowered, kind of arrogant fringe radicals in the faculty.
Does the Trump stuff make a difference?
I think everything makes it. It's all a political calculation. So any political, Columbia political calculation. So anything that kind of pushes them from one side to make change, as opposed to what's pushing them from the far left to not make any changes and allow the status quo from the past year to stay, because again, they support those protests. I think all of that comes together to drive Columbia's decision making. But I actually think that what we're seeing now with our new acting president is like a commitment to at least what I think are Columbia's values, you know, teaching, learning, research, you know, no disruption. She was very clear about the library situation, that it's just intolerable. She called the actions of the protesters outrageous, like as they were. And she called it took her, you know, less than a day to get the NYPD basically in there, instead of negotiating with the protesters the way that, you know, previous administrations had done at Columbia. So we're starting to see some change, but I think we just need to continue to move towards a status quo of strong, clear rules around student demonstrations and strong, swift discipline for rule violators. I think that's where we're moving towards and what we need to see. And at the same time, just rethinking or thinking about what does faculty governance at Columbia look like and what should it look like, and who should really be in charge of making these decisions. Because I think, as we've seen, like, there's a danger to kind of allowing for a total, at least, impression of democracy when it comes to making rules around protests, because the people who support the protests waltzed in, took positions of power as like chairs of the rules committee, for example, and basically wiped away all of the rules that had existed and instituted their own guidelines to the rules that said basically the university doesn't need to review it, there's no designated places, and you can protest whenever you want as long as you don't disrupt, but no definition of what that means. So all of these things I think need to be reviewed and looked at, and I think when Columbia gets to a point of strong rules, strong discipline, clarity over who's in charge of the rules, that's when we're going to start to feel like we're in a better place, and we're on that path, I think.
It's crazy that this is what you're dealing with in 2025. I mean, you're really talking about the quote unquote leaders as if they're like petulant children, in the sense that they're sitting there trying to change rules so that you can accommodate people that are going in and breaking things and occupying libraries. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy.
It's pretty crazy. It's crazy. I think it's also crazy. I'm sitting here like I'm 22, I'm a junior, and I like understand Columbia University governance structure. Like who would have thought that like that's what I would be thinking about as a student? I definitely would not have guessed that like university governance would be at all on my mind. But like I said, I really actually do think, like, especially after the situation in the library, like they actually responded really well. They did what they should do. They were clear about their expectations. They didn't negotiate with these idiots. Public safety stood their ground, and God bless them. 2 of them are injured, hoping that they make quick recoveries. And they called in backup when they needed it, when they realized they weren't going to be able to handle it, on their own. Like that is, and by the way, they've also issued interim suspensions. At least that's what's been reported already.
So you have dozens of soldiers that got, students that got suspended?
I believe so. I mean, I saw a report around interim suspensions, and one of the people that was in the building tweeted that he was suspended. He's a violent guy. He tweeted that he was suspended, and I'm like, great. I'm glad to hear that. And it could, this is the kind of stuff.
Have you had any weird interactions with these people in class? Like you see someone who is violent and maybe the day before is screaming at you, and now you're supposed to sit next to them in class?
Absolutely, yeah. I've had weird interactions where people from class, by the way, I go outside and I'm like, wait a second, I know you. And then we get like eye contact. I've definitely had my fair share of, on Broadway, like I see this kid from my class marching by screaming like death to Israel with a mask on, and I'm like, I know you, like I recognize you, and I go like this to him. I'm like, yeah, you're not gonna walk by me with this mask and think I don't know who you are. One time he tried to come up to me and say, oh, hey, how are you? And I was like, dude, get that out of here. Like, you need to stop. You need to cut it out, basically, with maybe a couple more bad words in there. But I basically was like, you got to cut this out. Like, you are absolutely destroying this school. Like, don't come up to me as if we're friends on the campus. That was someone who's, like, not Palestinian, not Arab, just a random kid who got involved with this movement. And then in class, sometimes I'm in these classes and I see people that I've had interactions with on the campus, and basically it's just tense, right? Like I don't get intimidated by this kind of stuff. So sometimes I try to make light of the situation, or I'll kind of like make jokes on the way out to the person, knowing that they're very uncomfortable, I guess, by being around me for some reason, I guess because I'm Jewish and open about it.
Very scary.
But yeah, exactly. But it can just be like, it's just like tense, awkward, and I try to kind of have fun with the whole thing.
I mentioned that insane person who supported cop killing at Brandeis, and in her post, she actually said that the Nation of Islam had come to accompany her that week on campus, which is quite nuts. And when I returned to campus, I actually had an armed security guard, or sorry, it was unarmed, but I had a full-time bodyguard because someone had advised me that they were potentially violent. And now 10 years later, she admits that she had the Nation of Islam with her on campus. So it's quite crazy.
Yeah, I mean, that's insane. That's truly insane.
Again, but this is college campus in America. I have nothing to say. It's just crazy. It's crazy.
It's insane.
You go to try to get an education, paying a lot of money, and some of these people have nothing better to do than to actively destroy the campus library and everything like that. Lishi, I really appreciate you taking the time and providing some insight into what's going on at Columbia. I know the headlines can be quite outrageous, and it's important to try to get a sense of what's truly going on, and appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you very much for having me. It was great.
Stay safe. And if there's any other big breaking news, I'd love to have you back on.
Let's do it.